Welcome to Untangling Traditions. Today we'll be speaking with Dr Jason Birch, a postdoctoral research fellow on the Hatha Yoga Project at SOAS University of London. Dr Birch is a Sanskritist who specialises in the premodern literature of yoga. He's well known for his important paper on the meaning of Hatha, which has reshaped our understanding of the origins of this term by locating it within Buddhist literature. His research has identified the earliest text to teach a system of Hatha and Raja Yoga, namely the 12th century Amaralga, and defined a corpus of Sanskrit and vernacular texts that emerged during Hatha Yoga's flouruit, the period in which it thrived on the eve of colonialism. Dr Birch is principal editor and translator of 6 Sanskrit texts that will be the primary outputs of the Hatha Yoga Project. He's also a founding member of the Journal of Yoga Studies. So welcome, Jason. Today we'll be speaking with you about your contribution to the AyurYog Project. So firstly, yoga and Ayurveda, Indian medicine, are often considered sister sciences. How far back does this relationship extend into the past?
Many practitioners do believe that yoga and Ayurveda are complementary. And so when Dagmar asked me to research the history of yoga and medicine, an obvious question to ask was whether the compatibility of yoga and Ayurveda was a belief that was pre-modern or perhaps more recent. I must say my research findings were in some ways surprising. I couldn't find a pre-modern equivalent to the term sister sciences in Sanskrit or any vernacular language. And on the whole, references to Ayurveda in a statement that might sort of suggest the same idea that yoga and Ayurveda should be practiced together are non-existent in yoga texts at least. So my research focused mainly on pre-modern works, and I suppose what I did find was that there was some interaction more in the background, you might say, in yoga texts, and there are some good examples that this interaction goes back to an early period, the period in fact when for example the earliest Ayurvedic works were composed. For example, in the Charaka Samhita, a foundational work on Indian medicine that was composed at the beginning of the first millennium, there's a chapter on yoga. And this chapter teaches a system of Ashtanga yoga that probably derives from a Buddhist milieu, because the 8 auxiliaries culminate in the practice of mindfulness. And I suppose this brings me to another point, that the early history of yoga and medicine are shaped by a complex dialogue between Vedic and non-Vedic religions like Buddhism and Jainism. Now, the view that yoga and Ayurveda are sister sciences is probably derived from the more orthodox Hindu belief that all knowledge systems within India derive from the Vedas, and that in fact yoga and Ayurveda are like Vedangas, they're like auxiliaries to Vedic knowledge. So the fact that the early history is being shaped by a dialogue between Vedic and non-Vedic religions doesn't quite fit with that narrative very well. What was even more surprising was that this term sister sciences is quite rare in published books on yoga. The earliest occurrence that I could find was in some magazines and books published in the 1970s. So I think it is a more recent expression, if you like. It perhaps overstates, I think, the historical interaction between yoga and Ayurveda, and it fits more with the current, particularly political view that yoga and Ayurveda are two ancient and valuable systems of knowledge that India can share with the world.
Fascinating. So do pre-modern yoga and Ayurveda share the same theory and terminology?
Yes, to some extent they do. In yoga texts, there are many references to the names of diseases, as well as the three humas, the doshas, that is kapha, pitta, and vata, usually translated as bile, phlegm, and wind. These terms occur repeatedly in yoga texts because it's often claimed that the techniques of yoga, and indeed just the general practice of yoga, can cure all diseases. However, when I looked closely at this terminology, it was never really specific enough to trace back to an Ayurvedic work. The terms, such as the doshas and the names of diseases, occur in many genres of Sanskrit literature, particularly Brahmanical works, as well as tantric works that preceded many of the yoga texts that I study. And perhaps what's more telling is that within yoga works, there are very few references to Ayurveda or the specialized knowledge of how to diagnose, treat, and manage diseases. So even though there is some shared terminology, it really wasn't enough to confirm that yogis had some training or learning in the science of Ayurveda.
So how does the Indian medical body compare with that of the yogic metaphysical body with its chakras, nadīs, kuṇḍalinī, etc.?
The knowledge of the yogic body was more inspired by earlier tantric traditions than medical ones. And in most cases, the theory of chakras, nadīs, and so on is greatly simplified in yoga texts. There are a few examples where the practice of pratyahara, in other words, sensory withdrawal, utilizes mama points, which are points where vital energy, prana, converges in the body. However, the mama points that we see in yogic texts do not map on to the Ayurvedic mama points. Their locations tend to be closer to systems of chakras and adharas. We have some lengthy passages on mama points in some early Ayurvedic works, such as the Sushruta Samhita. And they're important for surgery because these points are often very vulnerable, and if a surgeon were to damage them, the patient could die. So the locations, the attributes that the mama points have in Ayurveda is very detailed and specific, and we just don't see that in yoga texts. So that's an example where even where one might think that the yogic body is similar to the medical one, in actual fact, it's not.
Interesting. So the terminology is similar, but at the same time, perhaps describing different aspects of the body. So are there any historical examples of yogins who claim to be doctors or healers?
Yes, there are a few interesting examples of this. In the Yoga Yajnavalkya, which is a 14th century yoga text that had some influence on the Hatha Pradipika, there's a reference to a group of yogis who refer to themselves as the best Vaidyas, that is, the best doctors. They claim to be able to heal people through the practice of yoga. In fact, the practice of pratyahara that I mentioned a minute ago, it's based on the mama points. Now, the fact that they refer to themselves as doctors and used a technique that had the term mama in it, but in fact, those mama points are closer to systems of chakras rather than Ayurvedic mama points, suggests to me that they were perhaps competing with doctors. They were presenting themselves as doctors, but claiming to heal people through the practice of yoga. Generally speaking, within yoga texts, we see the frequent claim that yoga can heal all diseases, not just physical ones, but also mental ones, as well as the spiritual disease, if you like, of samsara. So going back to the time of the Buddha, there are examples of gurus presenting themselves as physicians and their teachings as a treatment for all worldly ills. Now, if a teacher believed that yoga could heal all diseases, why would they encourage their students to learn Ayurveda or consult physicians to heal their ailments?
So does the soteriological aim of yoga as liberation, mokṣa, conflict with that of Ayurveda for long life?
No, not in theory, because a long life should give a yogin more time to practice yoga and therefore attain liberation. However, I think in reality, yogis were more ambitious than Vaidyas. They wanted immortality rather than a long life, and a long life in Ayurveda tends to be defined as 100 years. And they wanted liberation, jivan mukti, relatively quickly. The time frame within yoga texts is usually 3 to 12 years, depending on the capabilities of the student. Now, in yoga, disease is seen as an obstacle because it can prevent one from practicing yoga, and the practice of yoga is usually the main method for achieving liberation. So it seems reasonable that yogis might have resorted to Ayurveda to cure their illnesses so that they could then practice yoga. But what we see, in fact, is that yogis tended to develop their own methods for curing illnesses. Yoga chikitsa tends to be tends to rely on specific capabilities that yogins have. The chapter on chikitsa in the Dharmaputrika is a good example of this. It requires the yogin to be able to concentrate and move prana internally within the body. Another good example are the Shat Karma that are first taught, as far as we know, in the Hatha Pradipika. These are therapeutic interventions that a yogin is supposed to resort to when he's suffering excess kapha, phlegm, or fat. Now, the Shat Karma, in most cases, require capabilities that come about through a prolonged period of training. Nauli, for example, requires the yogin to isolate the abdominal muscles, hold the breath out, and move the abdomen in specific ways. Now, yogis, after some period of training, can develop these capacities, but I'm not so sure that such techniques would be of value to Vaidyas, to doctors, because if a patient comes to a doctor with digestive trouble, it's often too late at that point to start training them how to do nauli or breath retentions or concentration techniques. So what we see in yoga are some unique remedies, unique treatments being developed over the centuries that were suitable for yogis, where yogis could often use them to treat themselves, whereas in Ayurveda, the emphasis is more on what a physician can do to help a patient, which usually revolves around, advice about diet and lifestyle and certain, herbal treatments and so forth that a doctor can give to a patient.
So in India today, it is common to see yoga institutions selling Ayurvedic herbs and medicines, such as Shivananda Ashram in Rishikesh, for example, and also sadhus smoking cannabis. Are there any instances of yogis using medicine in the past, and specifically cannabis, in medieval yoga texts that you study?
There are only a few significant references to herbs in yoga texts, and none whatsoever to yogis smoking cannabis, even in yoga texts that were composed relatively recently in the 18th and 19th century. It seems that proponents of yoga never saw herbs as important for achieving samadhi. Therefore, they're never really integral to the systems of practice that are described in yoga texts. There are a few passing references to herbs in that context. For instance, in the Amorauga Prabodha, a 12th century text, perhaps the earliest that we know, to teach Hatha and Raja Yoga, there's a mention that herbs can be used to achieve Laya Yoga. That's the yoga of dissolving the mind. However, in just about all other descriptions and definitions of Laya Yoga, it mainly consists of simple meditation and visualization practices. So that reference in the Amarauga is a one-off. Now, in terms of other references to herbs in yoga texts, usually when herbs are mentioned, they're mentioned in the context of achieving siddhis. There's a very good example of this in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, 5th century text, that in the 4th chapter includes herbs as one of the methods for achieving siddhis. And we also see this in later texts, such as the Yoga Pradipika. Herbs are mentioned as an effective way to achieve siddhis, these supernatural powers. However, very little information is given on it, and really what we don't see is the integration of a yoga practice with a regimen of, say, taking herbs. There's perhaps the closest we come to is the account of Khechari Mudra in the Yoga Pradipika, where the yogin is supposed to practice asana, some other preliminary techniques, then take some herbal formulas that are described in the text, and then he starts the practice of Khechari Mudra. But it's really just, in this instance, isolated to that technique. So generally speaking, I would say that the proponents of yoga viewed herbs as a secondary, if not altogether unimportant, method for achieving the most important aim of yoga, which was liberation. Now, that's not to say that yogis who were not heavily invested in yoga, who were not proponents, might well have dabbled in alchemy, Ayurveda, as well as practice yoga. In fact, in some travel accounts, such as Marco Polo's diaries, there's an account of yogis taking elixirs to prolong their life. So, of course, in reality, it may well have been the case that that yogis resorted to herbs. But I think what we can say, judging from a large corpus of literature that spans well over 1,000 years, was that it was never integral to the practice of yoga.
Wonderful. So thank you, Jason, for sharing your thoughts on this particular topic. You have a peer-reviewed paper specifically on yoga and Ayurveda published already in the journal History of Science in South Asia, so people can look for that if they want more detail. Also, you have 2 forthcoming peer-reviewed papers, one on Hatha Yoga's floret and another on the quest for liberation in yoga traditions. And of course, your 6 forthcoming critical editions and annotated translations that are major outputs of the Hatha Yoga Project. So we look forward to that work in the future. Thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks very much.